Thank you for joining us for the Miami Valley Salute to Veterans. I'm Cindy LaPointe-Dafler, a volunteer host for the Miami Valley Communications Council. My husband was killed in Vietnam in 1969 and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Why am I host for this? I love being around our veterans and talking with them, hearing their stories and their thoughts. This is my way of honoring my husband's legacy. We hope that hearing these memories from our veterans of our community will help us all better understand the dedication of those who served. Today we're talking with Mike Bevis of Washington Township, a Navy veteran who served from 1969 to 76. Is that correct?
Actually, 70 through 73.
70 to 73, okay. He'll tell us the story of his time in the military. Thank you for being here with us, Mike.
You're welcome. Thank you.
When you went into the military, why did you choose the branch that you did?
My father was in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
He was a gunner's mate on an LST, and he served in the South Pacific. He never talked about World War II very much, but he always said that he went in when he was very young, and he said, if you're going to give some time to your country, he said, I'd recommend you go into the Navy. He said, even though he had some treacherous times, I think, he said, you're going to meet a lot of people, a lot of men. At that time, of course, there were no women in the Navy.
Sure.
He said, you're going to make friends. You're going to be sleeping close to them in tight quarters, but you're going to have the same bed every night. You're going to have hot food, and you're going to get a chance to see the world. And so he recommended that, and maybe never recommended it, but he talked about it for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I have 3 younger brothers, and I was the only one who served. So I think that's probably the main reason was the recommendation of my father.
Yeah. So why did you make the decision to serve? I mean, was it that or be drafted?
Kind of yes and kind of no. The draft had the lottery had just begun. I don't remember the exact year, but it was probably around 67 or 68.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, actually, when I first went into college in 1966, I thought I would get into ROTC. Not knowing exactly what you're going to do when you graduate. The Vietnam War was heating up at that time, and I thought that being a member of Navy ROTC at Miami University would probably be a good thing to do. I would get part of my college paid for, and then when I would graduate, I'd have 3 years commitment. I also had 4 or 5 other good friends who were in the ROTC program.
Mm-hmm.
And during my initial physical, I washed out because I was partially colorblind. So then as the draft started to gain strength, I think I was 2 years through college. And as the war heated up, the Navy was back looking for, actually, all branches of the services were looking for more officers, and they came back to me and they said, if you would like to get back into the ROTC program, you could do that. You won't be able to fly a plane or steer a ship, but we need supply corps officers. And at that time, I was a business major, and that fit perfectly into that. So I had 2 years commitment at Miami, basically taking a couple courses each term, doing a little marching. And then when I graduated from Miami, I went to a Navy Supply Corps school in Athens, Georgia for 6 months.
Okay. And so where did you grow up?
I grew up in Cincinnati, on the west side of Cincinnati.
Okay.
And then had a chance I only applied to 2 universities, Miami and the University of Cincinnati. My grandfather went to UC and my mom went to Miami. And then actually the day I graduated from high school in Cincinnati, my family moved here to Centerville.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But Miami University's not too far away from
No,
home.
about an hour's drive. In fact, I'll be there tomorrow.
So when you signed up for the Navy, where did you go first for your basic, or I don't?
Sure. The first thing I did was I had to take, as I said, a couple courses at Miami. And then midway between my junior and senior year, I took a midshipman's cruise. And we went out of Norfolk, Virginia, and I was on a small aircraft carrier called the Yorktown. It was a CVS 10. And we went down from Norfolk and down through some of the islands in the Caribbean. We went down through St. Thomas and the Virgin Islands. And so I had the chance to spend 6 weeks learning a little bit about the Navy, not so much as far as the Supply Corps, but just learning about being on the ship. And spent, out of the 6 weeks, I probably spent 4 weeks on the aircraft carrier, and then I was highlined across to another smaller ship, to a destroyer. So, and then we came back to Norfolk, and so that was the 6 weeks of that. And then when I graduated from Miami, which would have been in May of 1970, I immediately went to Athens, Georgia, which is where the Navy Supply Corps School used to be. It's no longer there. So it was interesting for a young man who grew up in Cincinnati and stayed close to Miami University, and hadn't been away much. And all of a sudden I went down to Athens, Georgia, and I was kind of a Yankee in the South.
Yeah. So you were further away from your family.
I was.
Yeah. So how did you feel about that?
Well, I'd been away for college for 4 years.
Yeah.
And, I've been away for 6 weeks on that midshipman's cruise. So it wasn't tough going to Georgia because I could drive back in about, maybe 8 hours or so and come home if I wanted to. Athens, Georgia is a pretty good college town to live in, not unlike Oxford, Ohio, a little bigger, a crazy football town. But it was interesting, I think, living there. It was probably tougher, once I guess, graduated from Supply Corps school and then ended up, going around the world and being away from the family. That's probably one of the tougher times.
I gotcha. When you were in ROTC, did you take basic training then?
I guess I really wouldn't call it basic training. We had classes we had to take.
Oh, just classes.
And then we had some physical activities. We were required to take some type of a phys ed type of training. I mean, not everybody at college will take a physical education class like you had to take in high school.
Right.
But they recommended that we take one that was a little more strenuous, and so I took Taekwondo. So I learned about karate, a couple years of that, which was interesting. And then we had, I think, 1 or 2 classes every term on. It had to do much more with just different things in the Navy. It had nothing to do with the Supply Corps when I was there. And then the same thing when six months of Supply Corps training in Athens. But it wasn't like the basic training that a lot of other sailors would take, like up at Great Lakes up near Chicago. And it wasn't like some of the courses or things that they would take as far as officers training.
Wow.
So they kind of threw us, once I graduated from Supply Corps school, they threw us right into jobs on ships.
Oh my gosh. So what was your first assignment then?
My first assignment was I was assistant to the Supply Corps officer. He would have been, at that time, he was a commander. And so I worked in his office and did some admin things for probably the first couple of months or so. And they tend to rotate these Supply Corps officers off and on to the ship. And so after I was there for maybe 3 or 4 months, I took over what was called the wardroom. And the wardroom is the officers' mess. And so we had 550. I was on the USS Enterprise. And so we had 5,500 people on board the ship. And so we had 550 officers. That included the pilots who flew, the jets and the helicopters and things like that. So we fed them 4 meals a day. And so at that time I was like 23 years old, and I had 100 stewards that worked for me. I had some great chiefs. I never could have done it by myself. And we cooked, they cooked 4 meals a day, served them. They also maintained the bunk rooms where people slept, changing sheets and keeping them clean and things like that. So I think I had 4 chiefs that that reported to me. One maintained the wardroom, which is the food. Maybe there were 2 there. And so I did that for about a year and a half. Most of the stewards that reported to me, I think out of the 100, probably 95 of them were from the Philippines. They were Filipinos.
Oh, okay.
Which was interesting for, a guy coming from a community in Cincinnati that was not very well integrated.
Yeah, I understand. So where did you travel on this ship?
Well, I first met the ship in Newport News, just close to Norfolk, Virginia. And we immediately took off and headed south. And our first stop was Rio de Janeiro. So we were there in February, just right around when Carnival was going on. The ship was too big. It's about the USS Enterprise, it's gone now. It's about 4 football fields long. So it was too long to go through the Panama Canal. So we had to go around the bottom of South America, Tierra del Fuego, where the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Oceans meet. And that area is called Land of Fire. And it's because of the ways that the oceans come together at the bottom of South America. And so then we went around that. And when we went around there, the waves were very high. The flight deck over the ocean was about 90 feet high, and we took waves over the flight deck that night. Wow. So we all got into our bunks and strapped ourselves in, and then we went around the bottom of South America. We were supposed to come back and make a stop in Lima, Peru, but at that time, Allende was the president of Peru, and there was some unrest, and so we did not stop in there. And we went on into San Diego, and then on to our home port in Alameda, California, just across the bay from San Francisco.
Oh my gosh, that's quite a tour.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have other tours after that?
I did. We stayed in San Francisco, Hunters Point, and went a little bit of rehab work on the ship. And then we took off for our first trip to Vietnam, and we made a stop in Hawaii, which is an interesting story. And then on from Hawaii into the Philippines, where we were home ported at that time out of Subic Bay. Mm-hmm. And then we would go over to off of Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin, and up and down Vietnam, launching strikes into Vietnam, into North Vietnam. Most of the time we would be out on the line for 30 days, sometimes 45 days. And it was always interesting. They said, now, when we go over it was called a Westpac cruise, the Western Pacific. And when we're going over, we're going to be there for 9 months. But we knew from the very beginning we would be extended. So when they said we were going to go over for 9 months, we were over there for almost a year to be gone. And that's the tough point. I mean, I wasn't married at that time, but being away from your family, when you're gone for, Thanksgiving and birthdays and Christmas and things like that, that's the tough part. Yeah. But and so then we were gone for almost a year, going in and out of there. We made stops in Singapore. Rather than come back to the Philippines each time, we made a stop in Hong Kong. We made a stop in Japan one time. So we did get, as I said, I had the opportunity to get a haircut and see the world.
Yeah. So you were able to get off the ship at some of those stops, yeah.
Yes, and if we were in port for 3 days, you'd have to stay on the ship for 1 day in case the ship had to get underway, and then 2 days you could go off during the day and the night and be gone, but come back. Mm-hmm. Yes.
What did you discover?
Well, there's a couple things. So when we left and made our first trip, is we were about halfway across from San Francisco to Hawaii. We always had an admiral on board our ship, and you have to remember this is 1971, and he came to me as I was a junior ensign on board the ship, and he told me, he said, we're going to be developing a war room on board this ship. So we're going to have a room where we can look at all the slides that are taken for reconnaissance over Vietnam. And so when we get to Honolulu, you have to find us a reverse projection screen. Now, this is before the days of, computers and things like that. So I get off the ship, and of course, back then there's no internet to search. How do I find a rear projection screen? I mean, today, you could find it easily.
Amazon.
Yeah, so I had to run all over Honolulu to find the material that would be able to be made into a rear projection screen, and then I had to find the wood to put it together, and then we had to put it into this war room, and then teach people how to use the old slide projectors, the Kodak slide projectors, to put your slides in backwards so they would project onto the rear projection. So we were in Hawaii maybe 3 or 4 days, and I mean, you don't have a car. You're grabbing people to take you there and cabs, and trying to find out who does video, who does any type of electronics. And 1971 is not like 2023.
Yeah.
So that was the first experience that we had. I think coming to the Philippines was very interesting. Very poor community. The number of bars and I wouldn't say restaurants, but when you get off the ship and you leave the base and you go into the little town, it's just overloaded with bars and people trying to sell you things, and so it was a culture shock at that.
Yeah, that would be.
I think the town or the city that I enjoyed the country I enjoyed the most was Singapore. I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed traveling through that area. Singapore and Malaysia. We had some little extra time there, and that was good. Singapore was very, very, very strict, while the rest of the world was, men were growing their hair long and growing beards. Singapore was very strong on making sure that people stayed in line and didn't do things. I mean, you couldn't throw a piece of gum or a cigarette butt onto the street; you'd be arrested. So Singapore was interesting, very beautiful. I think that was probably one of the most interesting things. Hong Kong was very, very unique. Going back and forth from Hong Kong over to Kowloon and taking the Star Ferry back and forth. There were 2 signs I remember on the ferry when you would take it back and forth. One said, "Watch out for pickpocketers," and the other one said, "Do not spit." And I took pictures of those. I thought that was interesting. And so I made really good friends with about 4 other guys on board the ship. 3 were from the supply department where I worked, and 1 was a dentist on board the ship. And we kind of hung around together. And to this day, we still stay in communication.
Oh, that's nice. If you're just joining us, this is Miami Valley Communications Council Salute to Veterans podcast, and I'm your host, Cindy LaPointe-Dafler. Today we're talking with Mike. So you were there for a year back and forth between these other countries and Vietnam, and airplanes flew off your ship?
Yes.
Obviously, it was an aircraft carrier. Did you lose any?
Well, we would lose a plane or a helicopter probably once every week or 2. I mean, it wasn't unusual. The pilots who flew the missions, they were pretty fearless. I mean, most people who will be listening to this probably have seen Top Gun, and so they were known as Airedales on board the ship. They would sing a song called "Crash, Burn, and Die" because they knew it was very, very serious. But then when they would come back, they would brag about things that they hit. And since a lot of people will be hearing this, I won't say exactly what they bragged about hitting other than targets, but they were ruthless. They had a job to do, and they knew their life was in danger. But yes, we would lose a plane every couple weeks or so. We had one that came back that had been shot, and it was leaking aviation fuel onto the flight deck. And the worst thing you can have happen at sea is have your ship catch on fire, I guess, besides hitting an iceberg. And so they actually, because it was dangerous, a spark would ignite it. They actually pushed the plane over and just sunk it into the ocean, just got rid of it. I saw one time an A6, I think an A6, when it flew off, the canopy that protected the pilots just blew off as they were taking off. and they couldn't control it because of the wind force that was coming back on them, and so they ditched it, and then the helicopters picked them up. But then we didn't have flight operations all night, all the time. I mean, sometimes you did it at night, sometimes you did it at the day. And when there weren't flight operations, you were able to go up and walk around on the deck, and you could even jog around the deck. Remember, it was like 4 football fields long.
Right.
Yeah, I think we had flights all the time. I think we had well over 100 aircraft on board the plane.
Mm-hmm. So you met the pilots.
I did.
Did you know some of them?
I did, not real well.
Right.
We fed them, and I'd see them there. But you have your own job to do on board the ship.
Absolutely.
And there's not, it's not like getting together at a sports bar and watching a game and drinking beer. When you're at sea, sometimes you're on 8 on and 8 off. So you may work from midnight to 8 in the morning, and then you're off from 8 to 4 in the afternoon, and then you work from 4 to midnight. Mm-hmm. And it's a tough schedule to get your body adjusted to. But you didn't have a lot of time. And then when you went ashore, then you would normally, hang out with your buddies. Many times before we would come into a port, like when we came back to the Philippines, the planes would fly off and maybe fly into Clark Air Base. And so they wouldn't be on the ship when we were in port. Mm-hmm. They didn't always do that. They wouldn't do that in Hong Kong, and they wouldn't do that in Singapore. But they definitely did it before we came back into San Francisco.
Okay.
So they weren't always around. But yeah, I knew some of them, but not real well.
Good. Okay.
I think we did. I was told that we lost, it would have been February or March. I was told we lost the last plane of the Vietnam War. And that was I think a lieutenant commander so he was pretty high up. That was the last plane lost by the Navy in the Vietnam War. Wow. But I don't remember their names at the time.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, were you there when the war ended? Was your ship there?
They were starting in February or March of '73. They were starting to release prisoners from Vietnam, and our ship was still there. And I was scheduled to get out in May of '73, but at that time they started giving a lot of early outs to people, and they asked any of the officers, if you want to stay in, you could re-up for another 2 or 3 years. I forget what the number was at that time, or you could get an early out. And so they came to me, and we talked for a while about staying in. And I had been gone for 3 years. And I thought, it's probably time to go back and start my life as a civilian. And so I think it was March. It could have been late March or early April of '73. I flew off the ship in this one plane that was known as the COD, C-O-D, which stood for Carrier Onboard Delivery. You remember things like that. And flew then into Clark Air Base back in the Philippines. And then I waited there for a flight to take me back to the States. And at that time, there was a large influx of POWs coming back. And so they got first preference on these planes going back. Mm-hmm. And these are not like 747s. You don't have stewardesses and cabin attendants to take care of you. You're like in a jump seat. And so I sat in Clark Air Base for probably a week waiting to get on a plane. And somebody came to me and said, "Have you ever been a mail courier?" It's like, no. I said, "Well, if you had experience as a mail courier, you would get preference and you could be on the next plane and carry the mail back to the States." I was too honest at the time, I guess, and I said no. And so then there was some other talk, and I overheard some people talking, and they said, "Do you have any experience in drug problems?" I said, "Well, I was on a committee on board the ship trying to stop some of the younger sailors from bringing drugs on or taking drugs, because we had people who would go into Hong Kong and think they were buying, let's say, cocaine, and end up being heroin, and then they were snorting it back on the ship. And we had 2 or 3 young boys die. I want to tell you exactly how they died because it's pretty gruesome. Yeah. So I was involved in a committee to try to talk to people. Marijuana is one thing, but the harder drugs was another thing. At that time, marijuana was not as much as it is today,
Right.
but it was still being used. And so I said I was on a committee on board the ship to stop drug abuse. And so they said, would you like to accompany a sailor who has been arrested for smoking marijuana on board the ship back to Travis Air Force Base in San Francisco? And I said, sure, anything to get home. That would be great. So he technically handcuffed me to him, and we sat next to each other on the plane coming home. We stopped in, I can't remember whether we stopped in Guam or Midway on the way home, but we stopped in one of those places. And then, when we were on the plane, if he wanted to go to the bathroom, I'd walk with him, and he'd go, and then I'd take my turn, then we sit back down. So it was a long flight coming home, but it was an opportunity to get home at that time. But so many POWs were coming through Clark Air Base at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand. What else do you have to tell me?
Well, a couple fun things. One is that when I went from being in charge of the officers' wardroom, I did that for 1 year, and then I took over the ship's retail sales. So I became the retail sales officer aboard the ship. And so at that time, they were doing maybe about $300,000 in sales a year, mostly razor blades and cigarettes and deodorant and soap. And so that group had the stores, they had the barber shop, they had the tailor shop, they had the laundry, they had the dry cleaning plant. So I took this over. I think I had 4 chiefs working with me at that time. And so with 5,500 people on board the ship, and every payday, which was every 2 weeks was a payday, was over $1 million. The sailors were paid in cash. So you would sit there and count out like $100 here, and you check it. Somebody would check it for you, and you check it off the list, and then if you had to get a check, you'd take the money to the dispersing office, and they would give you a check, and you'd mail it home to your wife or family. So we started thinking, we probably could sell more things besides razor blades and cigarettes. And we had storerooms of cigarettes. Obviously, sailors smoked a lot. So we thought, let's do some other things. So we started carrying cameras and film. At that time, the pocket Instamatics came out, and so we went through about $25,000 of that between San Francisco and Hawaii. And then we said, if we can sell that, cameras, and that, why don't we start bringing in some nicer cameras, like some Nikons and Yashicas and Canons and things like that. So boom, the sales started to really grow. And we had never sold on board the ship. We had never sold greeting cards before. And we thought, well, that would be a smart thing to do, to sell greeting cards. So we started doing that. And at that time, America was just moving from long play albums to cassettes. So we started carrying cassettes. So I got a subscription to Billboard magazine and started seeing what the top songs were, so I could order the right cassettes. And then we started selling cassette players. And this is even before the days of the Walkman. So people would buy the cassette players and then listen to the music when they had time. So we did that. So then after that, we started selling stuffed animals, because men could send stuffed animals home to their wife or their girlfriend or their daughters, or if they had a girlfriend in the Philippines or a place like that, they could do that. The Admiral wasn't really happy with having a fighting ship, selling things like greeting cards and stuffed animals, but he put up with us. And then near the end of my term, we decided that we could sell things like the Sony Trinitron television had just come out at that time. So we thought we could sell televisions that the guys could take home to their house once we got back to the States. And then our last stop, when we came back, we're coming back to the U.S., we took orders for motorcycles. And so we sold 250 motorcycles, all Hondas and Suzukis and Kawasaki's and Yamahas. And so we took the sales from $300,000 in 1 year to $3 million the next year.
Oh my gosh.
So 10% of that goes back into what's called the Welfare and Rec Fund. So it provides television on the ship. It provides a basketball court on the hangar deck, and so that's what we did. So I think that was probably one of the most interesting things. Now, the second time we went over to Vietnam, I flew ahead of the ship. So as the ship went from San Francisco over to the Philippines, I flew ahead and went to Japan. And then I pre-ordered all of the cameras and the cassette decks and stereos. And then they put it in a container and shipped it to the Philippines. And then when the ship came into the Philippines, because it takes, I don't know, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to get there. So I met them when they came into port, and we unloaded everything there. So I went ahead of that. So I got to see Japan for the first time that way. And then when probably it had to be November or December of 72, we had been out at sea for a long time, and we were out of a lot of product on board the ship. And you start running out of things like cans of Coke and popcorn and cassette decks, and you get a lot of things from the other ships. They come up in what's called unrep. They highline things over to you or bring it over by helicopter. So you start running out of things. And so my boss said, so why don't you take the cod and fly into Da Nang? Because I had never been in country at Vietnam. And so I flew into Da Nang and then met up with an Air Force pilot. And I flew with him over to Utapao, Thailand. And I bought, just on signing my name with a purchase order, $25,000 worth of jewelry, mostly T-rings and things like that, and some bracelets and necklaces, and brought it back on board the ship, $25,000 worth. And we sold it in like 1 hour.
Oh my God.
So I spent one night in Da Nang and 2 or 3 nights in Utapao, Thailand, and then came back to Da Nang and took pictures of it as we flew over Vietnam, and then came back. But I never thought much about it. So, but it was good. It was really interesting going to Thailand. Beautiful country.
Oh my gosh.
So as you see, even while I was involved in making sure that everybody was fed and good things, it was a detached war for me. I knew we were flying it. You can hear the planes taking off with the hydraulic catapults. Mm-hmm. But obviously I was not face to face. I was fortunate in that area.
Yeah. What was Da Nang like?
It was well, of course, it was just a military base there,
right? And
so I didn't see much. You get off and you're seeing all the planes flying back and forth, and then I spent a night there. And I could get in with an Air Force pilot, so it was pretty stark. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like the Dayton Airport. A funny story is when he flew me over. I flew over with him to Thailand. He said, when you're here, he said, buy some jewelry for yourself. And I said, well, I'm not married. I don't have a girlfriend back home. And he said, well, let me tell you, I want you to buy some bot chains. And he said, it's little blocks of gold. And baht is the measure of, I think, of like money in Thailand. So I bought a couple of little baht chains. I think I gave one to, I don't know, a friend, and maybe one to a girlfriend. Lost them in the meantime. But he said, I want you to buy a Four Seasons bracelet. He said, it's a filigree gold. It's a beautiful bracelet. And they sell for about $100. And I said, I'm a junior officer. I don't have $100 to spend. I'm making, I don't know, $5,000 a year. And he said, trust me, buy it. And so I bought it, brought it home, and gave it to my mom. Spent $100. I mean, it was a beautiful bracelet, but $100 was a lot of money. So my mom passed away in 2004, and we had it appraised. It was now worth $4,000. So interesting story.
Nice investment.
Nice investment.
Oh my gosh. Mm-hmm. Well, do you have any amusing stories or unusual stories?
Well, I told the one about the drug thing. I think that was probably one of the most interesting things. When you first go into the ship, you live in a bunk room with like 7 other officers, so there were 8 of us, and one of the officers in the who was in our bunk room just hated the Navy. I mean, couldn't wait to get out. I mean, just couldn't wait.
Wow. And
he did everything he could to get thrown out, and he eventually got an admin discharge. And he was I was working that one night in my office. Not much else to do when you're at sea, so I was working. I came back to my bunk room about 10 o'clock, and they were laughing. I said, what are you guys laughing about? And they said, well, we were smoking weed here in our bunk room, and the Marines came up and caught us, and we're going to get thrown out of the Navy. And so he actually was thrown out of the Navy. got an admin discharge, and so I mean that he just wanted to get out so bad. He hated the Navy so bad.
Wow.
I think that was interesting. Another thing is when we were at sea one time and the waves were really, really, really strong. I mean, they could have been 30, 40 feet waves, maybe taller. And my best buddy was the dispersing officer. So he was in charge of the money and paying people. And his desk, right behind his desk, I mean, it was very close quarters, there were two safes stacked on each other. I mean, safes about, I don't know if you could take, let's say maybe 2 or 3 big coolers like you'd have on your back porch, with ice in it and pop. And so they were about that big. And so the waves were really heavy, so they sent us to bed that night. And when he came in the next morning, the top safe had fallen off and had crushed his chair and his desk. I mean, absolutely crushed it. A metal desk had crushed it. And if he had been sitting there that night, it would have cut him in half, would have smashed him.
Oh, yeah.
And so that was interesting.
Well, shocking.
Yes. I think probably the most interesting thing is that when you're away, you bond with the people that you work with during the day, and if you do get a day off to go ashore here, and as I said, I've stayed in touch with them. I think we bonded, and we were able to share stories with them. If we had problems, we'd share it. Our escapism was probably listening to music. At that time, as music had changed, so we listened to a lot of music. We would occasionally play cards in one of the little bunk rooms, for quarters on a Saturday night if we weren't working. But to this day, I just linked up with one of them, and he lives in Austin, Texas. And I just went down with my wife, and we had dinner with he and his wife about, I think it was back in March this year.
Wow.
And it was almost like 50 years to the day that since we had seen each other. But we had stayed in communication by phone calls and, of course, now by emails. So one of my best friends is in Austin. One is in Memphis. One's in St. Louis. We've lost touch with him. And one is a retired dentist in Seattle. So I think just how we bonded and how we've stayed in touch throughout the year. And I mean, there were some officers, there were some of my superiors I had that were, really, really smart people, and they knew what they were doing. And there were some that I kind of wondered, could they ever find their way in the real world once they got out of the Navy? I had one, it's kind of a funny story. He was a supply corps officer also, and he had very thick glasses. And when the planes are not flying, they keep them in the hangar deck, and they keep them chained down so they don't roll around. Mm-hmm. And so he was very nearsighted, and so he would always forget to duck his head when we would walk under the wing of an aircraft. Okay. And so he would hit his head on an aircraft wing occasionally. Well, it got to the point that we always warned him, John, duck your head so you don't hit your head. And then he would trip over the chain that held the plane down, and then stand up to because he was screaming and didn't hit his head on there. So he was my boss for a while. He drove a Volkswagen. He was from New York City. He drove a Volkswagen in San Francisco, beat up, torn up. The same guy who hit his head all the time. And he kept parking tickets. His entire car was filled with parking tickets from New York that he never paid. Oh my God. So one of the funny stories is someone told me that, once you get out and you look back, you'll forget the bad times and you'll remember the good times.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So that's true.
That's true.
So if a young person was thinking about going into the military, what would you say to them?
Oh, I would recommend it. The first thing is you're going to grow up quickly. Mm-hmm. You're going to be away from your parents and away from your friends that you've known. So you'll grow up quickly. You'll get a chance to see other parts of the world, I think, which is good. You'll get some discipline in your life, I think, which is interesting, especially in today's world. Yes. So I think... Yeah, I would recommend. I've recommended to a couple other people that they weren't sure what they wanted to do. Mm-hmm. That you'd learn a lot and you'd meet different people and experience it. So a story that kind of, not to drag this on, but a story that I think you'll find interesting is my dad never talked about World War II, even though he was in the battle over for the Pacific, and he was in Tinian and Inuiatok and anyway, there's another one that'll come to me, Saipan. And so he never talked about World War II much, but after he passed away, we found his diary and talked about the battles and things like that. Well, I'm a member of the Center for New Optimist Club, and one of our members was in those same battles. He's 96 years old now. My dad passed away in 2000, but this gentleman is 96 years old, and he was in the same battle that my dad was. He was coming in from one side of the island, and my dad was coming in from the other side of the island, and he did exactly like the same thing my dad did. And so I took him, my brother who kept my dad's diary, and I took him to lunch and reviewed. He's written 2 books. I think it's called Forgotten Heroes or Forgotten, it was something similar to that. And he, so we took him to lunch one day and reviewed my dad's diary with him. And it was like he had made a friend, someone else. He'd seen something in writing that he had written about in his book. I think that was a good thing that we had in common. Yeah.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
It also helped my brother and myself too, because since my dad had died in 2000, it kind of made a link with even though my dad was gone, it kind of made a link that we knew that our dad was there somewhere.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. What would you like people to remember from your story?
Well, like I said, for me, it was a detached war. I haven't talked at all about coming home. No one said thanks when I came home in 73. No one said thanks for serving. And it was not until probably somewhere around late 90s, early 2000, where I was talking with a gentleman who was a Marine, and he just said, thanks for serving. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't think I ever had anybody, call me a baby burner and things like that. But I think from my story is that the importance of giving back, I think, is one, of making new friends, of seeing the world, and getting out from your comfortable atmosphere of staying here in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. Also, to remember the wars that were lost. I mean, you and I met when we were here at the Wall That Heals, and to remember those that gave their lives. I was fortunate. Did I support the war? Sure, I did, but I didn't have a gun. And, I wasn't in jeopardy. I guess maybe I could have been in jeopardy going through Da Nang or something like that, but I never thought about that. Yeah. Even though we did lose planes and lose people all the time. But I think, to give thanks, because freedom is not free. It costs a lot.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate you coming and telling your story, and thank you for your service.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.